Welcome everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's BCD Travel Talk. Today we'll have a discussion with our colleagues from Advito to learn more about sustainability in business travel and their methodology to calculate business travel emissions. We are using Microsoft Teams live event. You can't speak up, but if you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A function at the right top of your screen and we'll answer them at the end of the session. Welcome again, and let me hand over to today's moderator, Jelle Barmelis. Jelle, the floor is yours.
Hello, my name is Jelle Barmelis and I'm a Senior Marketing Manager at BCD Travel. I have the pleasure today to welcoming you to our new online event about essentials for sustainable business travel. I'm not alone today. I also have the pleasure of being here with Shelley Fletcher-Bryant, Director, Sales and Client Management at Advito, our consultancy partner. And she is actually the subject matter expert on the topic of sustainability. We'll have a short conversation. I'll ask her a couple of questions about what it is companies can do to make their travel program more sustainable. But first, sustainability was already a very important consideration well before the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, we're noticing that it will become an essential piece in travel programs and business goals. Think about Microsoft, which recently announced it wants to become carbon neutral over the course of the next decade. And even looking at today's registrations for this online event, which has surpassed the hundreds, there's no doubt that sustainability is the next big challenge for the business travel industry. Also at BCD Travel, we want to be a part of this new sustainable future, and we think it's important to put our money where our mouth is. A journey which we already started in 2008 with our membership of the UN Global Compact, and also more recently in 2016 with our EcoVadis Premium Platinum rating. We've also joined other initiatives more recently, like the Science-Based Target initiatives and our Sustainable Air Fuel Agreement with Delta Airlines. If you're interested in any of our sustainability initiatives, I would like to invite you to download our recently published 2021 sustainability report. But today, we'll be focusing on you and your business and how you can make your program more sustainable going forward. I'm sure we're all aware of the basics already, like initiatives to reduce overall emissions, making sure you're working with sustainable suppliers and helping travelers make informed choices. So first of all, Shelley, welcome to this conversation. And I'd like to cut right to the chase here with you. When we're talking about sustainability, what does it mean? Is it as simple as traveling less or even traveling not at all? Are companies doing enough with offsetting emissions? Basically, how can travelers be more sustainable these days?
Thank you, Jelle. Thank you for the introduction as well. And hello, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. So a simple answer to that question is one of the biggest things that businesses can do is, of course, travel less. It goes without saying. And of course, we've seen this over the course of the past year through this pandemic. We've all been forced to travel less and use technology as we're using today. Virtual tools and virtual meeting fatigue has become a real thing. So we know that traveling less makes a really big impact because ultimately, obviously, you're removing that carbon from your program completely. But we also know that we can't remove travel completely. It makes sense that there are certain parts of the business that will always need to travel, will need to travel more. And as we start to see a return to travel, we're starting to see pickup in domestic markets, and we can see that there's opportunity for people to get back on the road. What we look at is how can they travel better? So when you've identified within your program the travel that you can take out. So where do you have unnecessary travel, trips of 1 day or less, internal meetings that just don't need to take place face to face every time? When you can't remove any more travel from your program, how do you travel better? And there are several ways of doing this where we look at different options within the program based on data to identify opportunities to make considered choices and to advise and support your travellers in making those choices. So I'll touch on that a little bit more in a moment. The next piece is using sustainable suppliers. So being clear in your sourcing strategy when you're sourcing your partners in air and hotel. Are they the optimum mix that enable you to help your travellers make sustainable choices? And then finally, around offsetting. Now, offsetting is the last piece of the puzzle, because actually the most important steps you can take are about travelling less, travelling better, and using sustainable suppliers. Offsetting, in our view, should only be considered as the final step to manage the residual in terms of what you can't do anything about, what you can't do anything better within your programme. And offsetting can be perceived as greenwashing. It can be quite a difficult area to get right. So making sure you're investing in the right programmes. We recommend gold standard programmes so that you can be sure the money you're investing in offsetting is going to a positive project. For instance, planting trees is not a great option when it comes to offsetting. That tree will take 30+ years to reach a level of maturity where it will absorb the carbon that you're looking to emit, and there's no guarantee that that tree will be there in 30 years' time. So just jumping back to travelling better, I think that's a key area where we can spend a bit of time today, because we know that people will be travelling, and actually everybody's desperate to start travelling again at the moment. So how do you travel better? Well, first thing is to assess your programme, assess a baseline and understand what your accurate emissions are today. Then look at the routes that you're flying. Take your top 10 or 20 routes and look at the airlines that are flying that route. Are they flying the most sustainable aircraft? For instance, we know that there are airlines flying quite a lot of older planes, B777s or A380s. Lufthansa has got a very nice shiny fleet of A350s, which is a much more efficient fleet. So actually you might want to look at switching your airline providers on some particular routes and look at where you can move to a more sustainable choice. Look as well at the routing, so look at the optimum routing. So we know that direct flights are a good option. That can actually impact your policy. You might need to change your policy from lowest logical to moving to direct to remove connections, but also looking at the difference that a different type of connection can make. Not all connections are equal. You have to look at the length of the leg, the airline that's flying that connection, and so on. But looking at that can make a difference. You can also look at different times of day of flight, because you could be flying with the same airline, but they might be flying a different aircraft on two different routes, on the same route, sorry, at two different times of day. So these simple changes can make a really big impact. It means you can still travel, you can still get from A to B, you're just making some responsible choices and guiding the travellers to make those choices. And then the last piece is about switching from air to rail. And that's a big opportunity in certain markets, not everywhere, but a big opportunity in certain markets where we can focus in on those key routes where you can identify that opportunity to switch, and you can identify an opportunity to save not only time, but also impact traveller well-being, meaning that they haven't got to transit through airports, they can get on a train and get from A to B. And this example here, just briefly, some of the arguments that you could maybe face about going with a policy of switching from air to rail on certain routes is that travellers may argue that it's going to take a lot longer for them to get there by train, and actually when they get to their destination they still have to take a taxi to get to their final destination. So is it worth it? Well, the short answer is yes, it is worth it. And what you can look at is some analysis, some door-to-door analysis on top routes, focusing on your specific office locations where your travellers are heading to, and look at realistically what the difference is when it comes to the emissions and when it comes to time. And you can see this example here. This was a Brussels-London example. We can see that the time difference is only 50 minutes when you take into account all of the transit time through the airport, waiting time, and the carbon emissions are dramatically reduced. So that's a key component for, particularly in Europe, we have a lot of options when it comes to high-speed rail. So that's a good one to look at in terms of switching.
Absolutely. And we've also asked our attendees here before the event and during the event to rate the importance of sustainability in their program today. And I'd like to have a quick brief look with you at the results that we're getting in. And you can see here that the majority, I'd say almost 2/3, are rating it very important today, somewhat important. Almost no one is saying that sustainability doesn't have any kind of importance for them today. So looking at this, thinking about your message, traveling better, I don't think we really have too much work in convincing the people here on the call today of that importance. Very important part you're saying there, travel better. you've covered rail, you've covered especially with a high-speed network in Europe, you've covered the airlines, but also, is that also applicable for choosing a hotel to stay in? Because you have the business trip, the first part is transportation, which is usually the most obvious part of offsetting, making emission savings. But looking at the hotel stay, is there also an opportunity there for companies to make better choices?
Yeah, absolutely. And it certainly is an important component to consider. When we look at the overall mix of emissions, generally speaking, you will find that between 80 to 90% of your travel related emissions relate to air. So we know that making changes in air will make a big difference. But also you can make very responsible choices when it comes to hotel. And importantly, more sustainable choices don't have to be more expensive choices. We know that that's often an argument, that's often a challenge that travel managers and procurement teams have to face, is how do we still enable our travellers to make responsible choices but keep an eye on the cost associated with it. So again, the first step is always going back to the data. It's understanding your programme today, understanding what your footprint was in 2019, because that is what we would class as a normal year. Had nothing changed, then we would have just continued the patterns that we had in 2019. So assessing 2019 gives you an opportunity to look at what your patterns were from an air perspective and importantly from a hotel perspective. We can then look at hotels that are doing certain things to make them more sustainable. So look at eco labels. We've done an assessment of more than 200 eco labels. It's a very scattered environment when it comes to the consistency of eco labels. So we've assessed more than 200 of them and looked at all of the criteria. So do they have publicly available criteria? Is there a third party audit? Are they validated? Do they have targets to hit? And built a ranking so you can be clear on if you do have a property in your programme that has an eco label, does it tick all the boxes? And then the other thing to consider is around amenities. And again, this is a challenge. Everything with sustainability has a balance. So there's a cost balance, but also there's an employee well-being balance as well. So for instance, if you have a traveller staying in a property that has 3 swimming pools and 3 restaurants and a gym and a sauna, they're probably going to have a lovely stay. But actually, the emissions based on that stay are going to be far higher than if they stayed in a slightly smaller property, maybe with 1 restaurant and maybe just 1 pool or maybe no pool. Then actually that traveller's individual carbon output will be much less based on that choice. And as I said, it doesn't have to be a more expensive choice. This example here was for a client that we worked with. We applied our calculation methodology to this to give a clear picture of what the emissions were based on how much energy it takes to create a kilowatt hour of energy for these properties in this location. And you can see actually that there's a cost saving as well as an environmental saving. So looking at your programme, looking at the properties, analysing them, you can then help to guide your travellers through some of the traveller engagement pieces, which I think we'll touch on in a moment as well, to help your travellers make the most informed choices aligned with your policy.
Absolutely. So that's very sorry to hear. No pool, or at least not a heated one at the location. A lot of business travelers will love that one. Maybe while we're at this traveling on the destination itself, you know, a lot of business travelers, they're also renting a car at the location, at the destination. We're seeing a lot of rise in electric vehicles as well. Are you also is it valuable for a travel manager to include a piece in their policy as well, on the way they choose to transport themselves on the destination itself?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, public transport, rail, where there are options for local travel, then that's a really good option. But yes, if we're looking at rental cars, building in the ability to have electric vehicles as part of your fleet options when it comes to choosing those vehicles is important. Now, I know today that can be challenging. The rental companies don't necessarily have an extensive stock of electric vehicles. They don't work for every traveller. If you're travelling a long distance, if you've arrived at your destination and you have to drive a lot, then it might not be the best option. However, we are seeing more and more electric vehicles coming into rental car fleets. We are seeing it become a more viable option. It's certainly something when building into your policy that it can make a big difference in looking at your emissions. Just a couple of caveats around it. It doesn't mean that you can hire a big vehicle because it's electric. We would always still advise to focus on those kind of standard economy size vehicles. And also it makes a difference in terms of the emissions when you're doing your calculations when it comes to the country in which that vehicle is being rented. So for instance, if you rent a vehicle in France or in Sweden, then the emissions are far lower than if you rent that vehicle in China. And that is based on the fact that the electricity mix in that country is powered very much by fossil fuel when we look at China. If we look at Sweden, for instance, they're using far more renewables. So not all electric vehicles are equal when you look at your carbon measurements. Just because it's an electric vehicle doesn't mean it's a one size fits all. From a reporting perspective, you have to consider the electricity mix in the country as well when you're considering the overall carbon output and impact.
Absolutely. I think that's a very valid point, because a lot of people might be choosing electric vehicles as their mode of transportation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the better choice there to make. So very valid point. But also looking at the future, I'm pretty sure some interesting developments, other developments are coming our way as well when it comes to mode of transportation. You've mentioned before taking the train whenever possible, public transportation. Of course, in this COVID era, it seems a bit a little tricky to do that at this point, but looking forward, I think that's really the way to go. Also, if you look at the newest generations of airplanes who are much more fuel efficient, and there are also new innovative concepts like the Hyperloop, for instance, which will definitely revolutionize public transportation. Are there any other examples that come to mind with you specifically, or initiatives that have been done in certain countries?
Yeah, I think very recently, just towards the end of last month, there was some great news articles from our perspective that in France they had banned short-haul domestic flights where there was a viable rail alternative, which meant the traveller could take the train and it would take them 2.5 hours or less. So I'm pretty sure that France won't be the only government to implement that on the very, very short haul domestic flights. I think there will be opportunity, particularly in Europe, to look at rail as a very viable alternative for those very short hop routes that we've all been very used to taking. These are the types of route where you would be often finding trips of 1 day or less. So people emitting lots of carbon to get from point A to point B and then back again in the same day. We would first challenge whether that trip even needs to take place. If it's such a short trip, can you not do it virtually? And then secondly, yes, I think there will be more governments, particularly around Europe, who will follow France's lead and look at potentially a ban on those very, very short trips where there is a viable rail option alternative.
Oh, absolutely. So it's a story about technological advancement, but also the regulator that needs to step in at a certain point. I just want to quickly look at our poll again, because we've asked the question to our attendees if they're currently incorporating any sustainability into their travel program or their policy, like carbon offsetting. And remember the first question, where we saw that a lot of people think that it's very important. We do see a little split here again. It's really less than half are saying that they actually are doing sustainability efforts in their travel policy or have defined it. So I think that's a big low-hanging fruit for a lot of companies to actually implement that in their travel policy. I'd just like to ask you, Shelley, do you have like a starting point for attendees? Because it can be daunting to start start implementing the sustainability. Is there any low-hanging fruits they can easily pick, or how would you go about that?
Yeah, great question. I think the first step is understanding your position today, really having a clear picture of, again, 2019. We all want to forget 2020 ever happened. So 2019 data to give you a picture of what potentially normal looks like. Then looking at where you can remove unnecessary travel. So as we start to see a return to travel, you want to try and avoid just going back to business as usual. So how can you adjust your policy to put more potentially hurdles in the way of people taking those short unnecessary trips? So really consider removing unnecessary travel. Understanding then through the data how you can look at optimizing travel to make those best choices. And we've created a methodology, a carbon calculation methodology, which is called GATE4, which stands for Global Analytics for Travel Emissions. This methodology gives a very clear and accurate report on carbon for all 4 categories of travel, so air, hotel, car and rail. It's ISO certified, which means that the calculations can be used in financial reporting. It's audited every year, and it gives a very robust output when it comes to complete carbon and greenhouse gas emission reporting. So through this, you can identify not only where you can reduce travel, but looking at aircraft types on your top routes to look at how you can make those switches. As I mentioned earlier, when we're looking about travelling better, you can make some very simple and small changes which will make a very big impact when it comes to your overall carbon emissions. And we know that people will still need to travel, so how can we help facilitate that so that they are making the best choices? So they're probably the first few elements, looking at taking travel out of the programme where you can, and then looking at where you can make switches. You can look at alternative airlines or aircrafts, or importantly, switching to rail on those particularly domestic European routes, and that then leads to changes within your policy to help then implement that company-wide, and that will then be supported by some engagement pieces around educating travellers.
Quick question about that. You've mentioned something very important there, financial reporting. I know that a lot of travel managers here are thinking about, in the end, their bottom line, their travel budget that they have available. And I assume that implementing sustainability, making choices comes with a certain price tag of its own. I can imagine that savings can be made along the way as well. But how, in your experience, how do you see travel managers are handling these added costs versus adding more sustainability or that focus in their travel policy?
Yeah, this goes back to what I said earlier, that everything is a balance, and it's about a culture. And what is the culture within the business? How seriously is the business taking sustainability? And how can you balance the potential cost against the employee well-being, against the environmental impact? You need to look at it holistically around people, planet and profit. And there needs to be a clear strategy defined to help travel managers ensure that they're ticking the boxes that they need to, but that they want to, and that the programme can be built in such a way that it enables change, it enables a reduction in carbon, whilst also enabling the management of financial targets as well. So we know for forever, lowest logical airfare has been the driving factor in making choices. So how do we ensure that actually making a sustainable choice doesn't cause massive issues when it comes to ultimately that overall travel budget? We would argue that to balance that, you would be looking at taking out unnecessary travel. So you would be looking at a cost reduction and also a carbon reduction with that unnecessary travel removed, which should then enable some scope to make more sustainable choices when it comes to air. And importantly, the reporting piece to highlight the key factor is, if you are taking sustainability seriously, if you do want to take action on sustainability, then having accurate reporting, so you have a really clear picture of where you're starting from on a monthly basis, what your emissions are, will enable you then to track those KPIs, track your progress against those KPIs, and ultimately find ways in which to engage your travellers to move them towards the right decisions. And by engaging your travellers, that's how ultimately you're going to achieve cost savings, you're going to achieve behavioural change, you're going to find ways in which to not only raise awareness and educate your travellers and your stakeholders, you will be able to influence them directly to make more sustainable choices. And this can be within your online booking tool environment. You can build merchandising, which is ultimately putting messages in the right place at the right time to steer choices. But also you can educate them outside of that with infographics and videos and targeted communications to help them understand the small changes they can make, how they can make a big impact on the overall environmental impact, and also guide them on how to make the right choices. So building out decision trees will help them make the right choice when it comes to maybe a flight that is slightly more expensive but has lower carbon emissions. And it ultimately all comes back to the culture of the business, the policy, and how far you want to take it as a business in terms of making those direct changes and driving that change within the business.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, it's about creating a culture and looking at our attendee numbers today, I think the culture, or a lot of companies are ready for this change culture, luckily. Absolutely. So I'm actually out of questions. There's one thing I wanted to mention. I think there was a very important point you made as well about the data, because it does start as well with the data. So I think this shows again that partnering up with a company like BCD Travel, who can provide you with that data on your travel policy, would be a great point to start, right? Because then you can actually see where are we currently and where do we want to go with our sustainability. Thank you, Shelley, for all this very valuable input, very interesting. I do think that we have a couple of minutes left for some questions from our audience, and I'll start with the top question. What is the top 3 tips? Kind of a rundown of this presentation. What's the top 3 tips now, actually, for people who want to start implementing sustainability in their travel program?
I could probably give lots of tips. I think, yeah, the top 3 probably, I've said it several times, data. You must start with the data, understand where you're at today, have a picture of where you want to get to, so that you can set some realistic targets and understand what levers you can pull. One thing I didn't mention around that kind of target setting is, once you've understood the data and you've identified the reduction that you want to deliver within a year, 5 years, 10 years, whatever it might be, you need to be able to build a tangible roadmap as to how to get there. Otherwise, it's just a big, scary number, and it's very difficult to get to that point. So one of the areas that we support with and look at building is setting out that roadmap. So let's say you have an overall target of a 30% reduction in 2 years' time, for instance. We would then look at a country by country level and look at all of the different levers you can pull. So what shift do you need to make to air to rail in Germany? What shift do you need to make from a route perspective between the Netherlands and France? Looking at those different options to kind of give you that roadmap which then you can track against. So the first piece there is looking at the data and setting your clear objectives. The next piece then is really looking at your policy and looking at how your policy supports or doesn't support sustainable choices, and making some changes across the board in your policy where you need to help your travellers make better decisions and to give them the confidence that they can make those decisions aligned with your sourcing strategy and your sustainability strategy. And then the third piece is using that data, building on the policy, is then educating your travellers. So how do your travellers know what the right choice is to make? We know generally travellers do want to make the right choice, they just might not know what that choice is, and particularly if the policy changes, they need to know about that, and we need to find ways to make sure that they're educated and aware and can make choices. So I would say that, yeah, those 3 key areas are around data and KPIs, setting out your plan, looking then at your policy and making adjustments within your policy to support that plan, and then educating your travellers through employee engagement, strategic internal marketing, communications to help guide them when they're planning a trip. So before they get into the booking tool, with different types of communications, using your intranet, using a social community if you have one, post lots of engaging content and videos and infographics and information. And then within the booking tool itself, consider looking at merchandising to help guide decisions based on specific search criteria. You can have pop-up messages and banners and information that helps guide travellers to choose a particular airline or a particular flight time because you know that there's a more efficient aircraft flying on that particular route.
And travellers, just wondering, travellers really, when they see that comparison, when they see that call to action to choose that more sustainable, is that something they generally do, or do you have any experience with that? Are you able with good engagement to pull them in making the right choice? Or are people grown into their habits sometimes, as you know, a lot of them are?
It's a really good question, and yes, there is a case for people will always do what they've always done. But if you can give them a good reason to consider an alternative, if you can make it easy for them to consider an alternative, so signpost them all the way along, make sure that the results are displaying so that they don't have to scroll, so that they can find exactly what they're looking for, give them easy access to additional information to help them with their search and help them with their choice, we do see behaviour shift. And I think we're in the perfect time now where people have been forced not to travel for such a long time. Everybody's going to be starting from scratch again. Even our road warriors, there are very few of them who have been able to travel to the level they would have normally travelled during this period. So we have an opportunity to change behaviour. We have an opportunity to press the reset button, and why not do that and make a big impact and change that culture and encourage people to come with you on that journey to make more sustainable choices when they do have to travel for business, help them make the choices that ultimately help the environment, help them, and still support the business.
Absolutely. Let's hope we made a good start here today with our attendees, making it more convenient, making it easier for them to start incorporating sustainability in their travel program as well. Thank you again, Shelley. Thank you for all our attendees for joining us today. The recording of the session will be sent to you later today or tomorrow. Please share it with your colleagues or peers that might find it useful as well. And I'm very happy to invite you already to our next BCD Travel Talk, which will be about digital health passes on Tuesday, June 15th. Same time, same place. We look forward to seeing you again at our next online event. Have a great rest of your day.